She was a girl whose very presence seemed to soften even the harshest edges of life. From childhood, she carried a purity that was untainted by envy, greed, or bitterness. Where others quarreled, she soothed. Where others took, she gave. Her hands were always busy with the work that others overlooked, fetching water for the elderly, weaving mats for those whose fingers trembled with age, sharing what little food she had with children who came to her door with hungry eyes. Her laughter was gentle, her eyes bright, and her words carried a wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. People said she had been kissed by the morning sun, that she carried the blessing of the ancestors within her spirit. But in a world where light shines, shadows gather, and in her village, those shadows began to stir against her. Her resilience was part of what set her apart. Life in the village was not easy. Fields demanded endless labor, the rains came late or too heavy, and famine was a constant fear. Yet she bore every hardship without complaint. When her kin snapped at her or treated her as lesser, she endured. When tasks were piled unfairly upon her, she did them with quiet determination, as though she understood something others could not, that enduring cruelty without surrendering one's spirit was its own kind of power. And though her heart sometimes ached, though tears sometimes blurred her vision in the lonely hours of the night, she never allowed resentment to take root within her. It was this unbroken strength that drew whispers of both admiration and envy. Her kin, who should have loved her most, often turned their faces away from her goodness. For in her purity they saw a mirror of their own failings. Where they schemed, she was honest. Where they wasted, she preserved. Where they snapped in anger, she replied with patience. And rather than seeking to learn from her, they allowed their bitterness to fester. "Why should she always be praised?" her stepmother would mutter. "Why do the elders look to her when she is no more than a girl?" Others nodded, secretly agreeing, their jealousy taking the form of ridicule. They mocked her simple clothes, her bare feet, the way she sang to herself while gathering wood. What they could not destroy in truth they tried to belittle with words. But words alone could not dim her. The children of the village still flocked to her side. The elders still smiled when she passed. Even the animals seemed drawn to her presence. Goats and chickens settled near her feet, and birds lingered in the branches when she sang. To some, these were signs of a blessing, perhaps even a gift from the unseen world. To others, it was reason enough to hate her. For if the ancestors had chosen to favor her, what did that say about those who spent their days clawing for power, respect, and wealth, yet never received such quiet reverence? Her goodness contrasted sharply with the cruelty that began to surround her. Her kin took advantage of her willingness to serve, piling burdens upon her shoulders until her body ached. While other girls of her age danced at the festivals, she was left to wash the clay pots and clean the ashes from the fire. While others ate the sweetest portions of meat, she was given only scraps. Yet even then she gave thanks, for she believed that gratitude was a way of surviving sorrow. When she smiled in the face of their malice, it was not out of naivety, but out of a stubborn hope that someday kindness might soften even the hardest hearts. Still, hearts of stone rarely break so easily. The more she endured, the more they despised her for enduring. They whispered that she thought herself better than them, that her silence was arrogance, her patience nothing but pride hidden beneath false humility. The stepmother, in particular, grew venomous in her resentment. She could not bear the way villagers compared her own daughters to the girl, nor could she stand the way the girl shone despite being denied joy. Resentment twisted her words into poison, and soon she began to plot ways to bring the girl low, to humiliate her until that light dimmed forever. Yet even as resentment brewed around her, the girl held close to her values. She greeted each morning with a whispered prayer to the rising sun. She touched the earth with her hands, thanking it for bearing her weight another day. She sang quietly while she worked, not for recognition, but because it made her spirit feel lighter. There were moments, fleeting as the breeze, when she sensed the cruelty surrounding her would someday demand a price, but she did not dwell on it. To live with bitterness would be to let them win. And so, she lived with grace, unknowing that her very grace would become the spark that ignited the wrath of those who envied her. The village saw in her a contrast too sharp to ignore. A girl of humble birth, dressed in rags, yet carrying a dignity that no wealth could buy. While others fought over portions of food, she shared hers with a smile. While others cursed when the rains delayed, she knelt and prayed. It was as though her spirit was woven from threads untouched by malice, and that was something her kin could not forgive. They had to break her to show that she was no different from the rest of them. But what they did not know, what they could never understand, was that some spirits cannot be broken by cruelty, only awakened. And so, resentment sharpened into cruelty, cruelty into schemes, and schemes into the terrible fate that awaited her. For all her goodness, for all her quiet resilience, they had decided that she must suffer. They would lock her away, starve her, crush her spirit. Yet the girl, though innocent, carried within her the quiet strength of something eternal, something the earth and fire themselves would one day recognize. The contrast was clear: her purity against their cruelty, her light against their shadow, her patience against their hatred. This was the balance that fate itself was preparing to tip, and in that imbalance, something beyond human hands would awaken. They had watched her for years, silently nursing their envy until it turned into something poisonous. The girl's quiet strength, her refusal to bend under cruelty, became a thorn in the hearts of those who despised her. They could not understand why, despite all the burdens placed upon her, she never broke. Each time she endured, it was as if she was proving that their malice was powerless. That truth infuriated them. It whispered into their minds late at night that perhaps she was not ordinary, that perhaps she carried something the ancestors had given her, something that made them lesser in comparison. And so, their jealousy twisted itself into a decision darker than any they had made before. It began with whispers in corners, in the dim glow of the fire when the moon was high. The stepmother's voice was sharp, slicing through the smoky air as she told her own children that the girl was cursed. "Do you not see?" she hissed, eyes narrow and lips curled. "Why is it that misfortune has clung to us since she came of age? The crops fail, the rains betray us, and yet she alone walks about as though untouched. It is her presence that sours our home, her false goodness that deceives the villagers into pitying her while we are left in shadows." The children, taught from birth to follow their mother's bitterness, nodded eagerly, their hearts already heavy with resentment. Word spread quickly, carried like smoke on the wind. Each person who resented her seized upon the idea as if it had been waiting inside them all along. She became the easy scapegoat for every hardship the village had faced. A goat lost to the wilds? It was her fault. The river running shallow before the harvest? Surely her spirit had cursed it. A child falling sick with fever? They whispered that her hands, though gentle, carried misfortune. Soon, the chorus of suspicion grew louder, and even those who once admired her grew hesitant, unwilling to defend her against the crowd. In a place where survival depended on unity, no one wanted to risk being tied to the girl whom others had already branded unlucky. Her stepmother knew this moment was her chance. She gathered her kin in the darkest hour before dawn, when silence stretched across the huts and the fire burned low. "We cannot bear her any longer," she said, her voice low but firm. "If we let her remain among us, she will ruin us all. We must do what is necessary. We must shut her away before her curse spreads further." The words fell into the silence like stones dropped into a well, heavy and final. Some hesitated, shifting uncomfortably, but none dared to defy the will of those who spoke loudest. Jealousy and fear are strong companions, and together they bound even the faintest of doubts. The plan was simple, and in its simplicity, it revealed the cruelty of their hearts. They would lock her in the old hut at the edge of the village, the one no longer used because its roof sagged and its walls smelled of rot. There she would stay, far from the eyes of those who might be tempted to pity her. They would tell the others she had been set apart for cleansing, that she needed to atone for the curse that clung to her. No one would dare interfere. Superstition had already painted her as dangerous. Once the door was sealed, she would starve. Slowly, quietly, she would fade away until there was nothing left of her light. It was not an easy decision for all, but those who wavered were silenced with sharp words. "Do you wish for your children to sicken?" the stepmother demanded. "Do you want your fields to remain barren? Will you allow one girl to drag us all to ruin?" Fear tightened their throats, and fear makes cowards of even the kind-hearted. Soon all were in agreement. They would do it together so none could be blamed alone. Their plotting became a ritual of its own, gathering reeds to bind the door, collecting stones to weigh it shut, choosing the hour of night when no one would see them drag her across the village like a lamb to the slaughter. What chilled the air most was not just the decision itself, but the coldness with which it was carried out. They spoke of her as though she were not flesh and blood, not kin, but something inhuman, an object to be disposed of. They spoke of her smile with disgust, of her kindness as though it were a trick. "She fools the children, but she cannot fool us," muttered one. "Even her silence is dangerous," said another. Their voices overlapped, weaving a tapestry of lies so tightly that even they began to believe it. By the time the plan was set, their fear had convinced them they were righteous. In their minds they were not plotting murder, they were protecting themselves from a curse. As the night of the deed approached, the air in the village grew heavy with unspoken tension. The girl herself remained unaware, going about her chores with the same quiet diligence as always. She fetched water, she swept the dust from the floor, she sang softly as she worked, the sound carrying through the air like a bomb. Those who heard it felt a flicker of doubt, but they buried it quickly, refusing to let compassion loosen their resolve. For compassion is dangerous when cruelty demands unity, and they knew that if they faltered, they too might become outcasts. When the final night arrived, the moon hung low and pale, its light silvering the huts and the silent trees. They gathered in shadows, holding reeds and ropes, their faces set in grim determination. The decision had hardened into action. They told themselves it was for the good of the village, but in truth, it was nothing more than their jealousy-given teeth. They had chosen to destroy what they could not break, to silence what they could not tarnish. And so, with hearts colder than stone, they prepared to carry her to the hut, to shut the door on her light forever. The night they chose to carry out their plan, the air itself felt complicit in the cruelty. The sky was clouded, the moon hidden, and a stillness lay heavy over the village. Dogs did not bark, owls did not call. Even the insects seemed muted, as though nature knew what was about to unfold and recoiled in silence. In the center of the village, the conspirators gathered, their faces lit by the flickering firelight. Shadows stretched across their hardened expressions, hiding the shame that some felt deep down, though none would dare admit it. The girl, unaware of their intentions, had been finishing her nightly tasks. She carried a small calabash of water, humming under her breath, her song soft and filled with the kind of peace that only she seemed capable of maintaining despite the hostility around her. But when the group approached her, their voices low and urgent, her heart began to sense what her mind could not yet comprehend. Her stepmother seized her by the arm, her grip like iron, and with a sharp command the others surrounded her. At first she asked gently, confusion clouding her eyes. "Where are you taking me?" Her voice was calm, hopeful even, as though she believed this might be another cruel chore or punishment. But when no answer came, only stony silence and tightened grips, her calm gave way to fear. She struggled, pleading now, her voice rising. "Please tell me what I have done. I will make it right. Do not treat me like this." But her words fell into the void. Their silence was heavier than stone, and not one of them looked into her eyes. They dragged her through the sleeping village, her bare feet scraping against the hard earth. Each step pulled her farther from the light of the communal fire, farther into the darkness where the old hut stood, a place shunned, abandoned long ago, its thatched roof sagging and its wooden walls leaning like a broken skeleton. As they drew closer, her resistance grew frantic. She twisted in their hands, clawed at their arms, tears spilling down her cheeks as she begged them to stop. "Please? I have done nothing to harm you. Why are you doing this?" Still not a single answer came. The only sound was her own voice breaking against the night, carried by the wind, ignored by every ear. When they reached the hut, the air smelled of dust and rot. The doorway gaped like a hungry mouth waiting to swallow her whole. She stumbled as they pushed her forward, her knees hitting the earth hard, but she rose again, desperate, her hands clasped together. "I am your daughter, your sister, your kin. How can you cast me away?" Her stepmother's eyes were cold as flint, and she spat words meant to slice through any last thread of mercy. "You are nothing but a curse. Tonight we rid ourselves of you." The girl screamed then, a sound raw and piercing, shaking the night. She tried to break free, but too many hands held her. They shoved her through the doorway, her body hitting the dirt floor inside. She scrambled up, rushing for the exit, but reeds and ropes were already being pulled tight. The door was slammed shut before she could reach it, the crack of wood and the scrape of stone sealing her fate. Her small fists pounded on the inside, each thud echoing like a drumbeat of despair. Her cries rose higher, cutting into the silence of the village. "Do not leave me here. I beg you, do not do this." But outside they worked quickly, weaving reeds across the doorway, hammering stakes into the earth, stacking stones until the entrance was blocked. Her voice filtered through the gaps, pleading, sobbing, calling each one of their names in turn, but they turned their backs on her words. Some shuddered as they heard her cry for mercy, but others hardened themselves with whispers of justification. "It is for our own good. It must be done. She is cursed." The children of the conspirators had been brought along to watch, to learn the lesson of obedience. They stood clutching their mother's skirts, their wide eyes reflecting the firelight. They too heard her cries, but when they looked up at the faces of their parents, they saw only sternness, and so they said nothing. That night, silence was demanded from all. Compassion had no place. Inside the hut, the girl continued to scream until her throat was raw, her voice hoarse. The sound shifted from anger to despair, then to desperate prayers whispered through sobs. Ancestors, see me. Spirits, hear me. If there is justice, let it not end like this. Her voice quavered and broke, but even in that darkness she clung to hope that someone, anyone, might have the courage to undo what had been done. But no one came. The villagers, one by one, drifted back to their homes, though sleep did not come easily. The stepmother and her kin lingered a little longer, staring at the sealed hut, as if reassuring themselves that the deed was truly done. When they finally left, the night swallowed the place whole, leaving only the faint sound of the girl's muffled cries leaking through the walls. Her voice carried into the stillness like a wound on the night, an echo that seemed to cling to the air long after they had turned away. The village returned to its uneasy quiet, but the hut stood like a grave already filled, her pleas lingering within it, haunting, unanswered, and unforgettable. The days inside the hut stretched into an eternity, each moment marked by the cruel rhythm of hunger gnawing at her body. At first, she clung to the hope that someone would come, that her kin or a compassionate neighbor would undo the cruel lock and release her. But the silence outside was unbroken, save for the occasional distant sound of life in the village, the lowing of cattle, children's laughter, footsteps in the dust. Those noises, faint and fleeting, mocked her with the reminder that the world continued without her, that her suffering was unseen and deliberately ignored. The first day she screamed until her voice gave out. She pounded the walls of the hut with her fists until her knuckles split and her hands throbbed, but the reeds and wood held firm. The air inside was heavy with the smell of dust, dried grass, and her own sweat. The darkness pressed close, broken only by thin slivers of light that filtered through the gaps in the thatch, illuminating nothing but emptiness. She wept until she could weep no more, her body racked with sobs that eventually gave way to silence. By the second day her voice had become a rasp. Thirst clawed at her throat, more painful than the hollow ache of hunger. She licked the damp soil in the corners of the hut, desperate for moisture, but it only left grit on her tongue and deepened her shame. Weakness began to creep into her limbs, her movements slowing, her body folding into itself as she curled on the dirt floor. Yet even in this torment she whispered prayers into the suffocating dark. Ancestors, do not abandon me. River spirits, sky spirits, hear me. If my people will not see my worth, let the earth itself remember me. Her words trembled, thin and fragile, but they carried the last threads of her will. On the third day hunger gnawed like a beast inside her belly. She dreamed of food, roasted yams, steaming pots of porridge, sweet fruits heavy with juice. She imagined water cool against her lips, imagined the laughter of children as they shared calabashes of milk. Yet each dream collapsed into the bitter truth of her emptiness. When her stomach growled, it sounded like a beast mocking her. She pressed her hands against her abdomen as if she could quiet the torment, but the pain only grew sharper. Her lips cracked, her tongue swelled, and she felt her body weakening, her breaths growing shallow and uneven. Still, she did not surrender her voice. She began to sing, her tone faint, trembling, but steady enough to echo in the silence. Her song was not one of bitterness but of sorrow and longing. She sang of the river that had once soothed her, of the wind that carried scents of rain, of the earth that had always held her footsteps. Her song filled the small hut, and though no ear outside admitted to hearing it, some villagers swore later that they had caught fragments of it drifting into the night air. Children whispered that the wind carried her voice, though their parents silenced them with harsh words. By the fourth day her strength was nearly gone. She could no longer sit upright for long, her body collapsing into the dirt. Her hair tangled, her skin clung tightly to her bones, and her eyes, once bright with life, glimmered faintly in the dim light that seeped through the cracks. When she tried to speak, the words came slowly like embers burning low. Yet she still spoke, still prayed, still sang. Her whispers became confessions to the darkness. Her fears, her unfulfilled dreams, her plea that her life not end forgotten in a hut of dust and silence. The nights were the hardest. Cold crept in, biting her frail body, and the sounds of the village seemed far away. She would curl into herself, whispering lullabies her mother once sang to her, the melodies carrying her back to moments of love she feared she would never feel again. Sometimes she thought she heard footsteps outside, pausing at the hut's walls, listening. Her heart would leap with hope, but the footsteps always retreated, leaving her once again with nothing but shadows and silence. By the fifth day she began to drift between waking and dreaming. Visions blurred with reality. She thought she saw sparks of light flickering in the corners of the hut, as though embers lived within the walls. She felt warmth on her skin when there was none, and sometimes she imagined voices whispering her name with gentleness instead of malice. These visions comforted her, though whether they were real or born of her weakening mind she could not know. Her despair deepened, yet so too did her strange sense of connection. She felt the earth beneath her body, the dust against her skin, the breath of the wind slipping through the cracks. She began to believe that something greater was listening, that the world itself had taken note of her suffering. "If no human remembers me," she whispered, "let the fire remember. Let the earth remember. Let the night carry my voice." And so she endured, each breath a victory, each whispered song a defiance. Though her body withered, her spirit did not break. In that small hut, in the depths of her hunger and despair, she planted the seeds of a force that would not remain silent forever. The cruelty that had sought to bury her would, in time, awaken something that none of her tormentors could have imagined. At first, it was only a warmth, subtle and almost tender, like the gentle touch of the sun filtering through the gaps in the thatch. She thought it was her imagination, a final kindness her mind granted her as her body withered from thirst and hunger. Yet the warmth grew, spreading across the dirt floor of the hut, climbing the walls, lingering in the air until it pressed against her skin with a steady insistence. She opened her eyes, weak and dazed, and saw it, a faint glow in the corner like the last breath of a dying ember. Her heart stuttered, caught between fear and awe. She crawled closer, dragging her frail body across the dust, her palms leaving imprints as though the earth itself was softening beneath her. The ember flickered once, then again as if responding to her presence. She gasped, a dry, broken sound, and the glow grew brighter, pulsing faintly with the rhythm of her shallow breaths. Each exhalation seemed to feed it, each whisper a kind of fuel. She whispered a prayer, and the ember brightened. She sobbed, and the ember flared like it was alive. Heat began to build in the hut. Not the suffocating heat of the sun, but a rising warmth that carried purpose, that coiled in the air like a living thing. The girl pressed her palm against the ground, and the soil felt hot beneath her touch. The dry straw in the corners rustled though there was no breeze, and faint threads of smoke curled upward, too fragile to be real, too insistent to be ignored. Her body trembled, not from fear but from recognition. Something had come to her, something that had heard her suffering, something older than the cruelty of kin or the silence of her village. At night, when the wind moaned through the gaps in the hut's walls, she began to notice sparks dancing across the floor like fireflies, tiny golden lights that flickered and vanished before she could catch them. At first, she thought she was delirious, that her mind was weaving illusions in her starvation. But the sparks returned again and again, always brighter, always lingering longer, until she no longer doubted their reality. They came when she sang, when she prayed, when her voice rose from despair into defiance. They came because she called them. Her breath itself grew strange. Each exhalation left her lips warm, as though she carried embers inside her chest. Sometimes when she spoke, her words seemed to glow faintly in the air, shimmering like smoke from a hidden flame. She pressed her hands to her chest, terrified and exhilarated, feeling the thrum of something stirring deep within her ribcage, something that did not belong to flesh or bone. The fire was no longer just outside her, it lived within her. The villagers who passed by the hut at night began to whisper uneasily. Some claimed to see faint light flickering through the thatch, like a candle left burning inside. Others swore they smelled smoke, though no firewood had been carried near. Still, no one dared to open the hut or check, for to them she was already condemned. They told themselves the girl's suffering could not summon anything beyond her own fading breath. Yet when the dogs barked at the hut, when goats refused to graze near its walls, when the air around it grew unnaturally warm even in the cool of night, they began to avert their eyes and quicken their steps. Inside, the girl was no longer afraid. The fire was not cruel. It did not burn her, though it licked at the thatch above and curled along the dirt below. It cradled her, gave her warmth where hunger gave her only cold emptiness. When she pressed her hand to the ground, the soil vibrated faintly, as though embers beneath the earth were waiting for her call. She realized with growing clarity that her prayers and songs had been answered, not by human mercy, but by the restless force of fire itself. On the fifth night, as she lay half-conscious, she opened her eyes and saw flames dancing along the walls. Not consuming, not raging, but shifting like shadows, curling like ribbons of light that traced her form. She stretched out her hand, expecting pain, but the fire wrapped around her fingers like a ribbon of warmth, alive and listening. She whispered her sorrow into it, and it flared, glowing brighter as though drinking in her grief. She whispered her anger, and the flames rose higher, crackling though they burned nothing. When she whispered her name, the fire whispered it back in the rustling crackle of heat. Her hunger still gnawed at her body, her thirst still parched her lips, but she was no longer powerless. The fire grew with her emotions, answering her cries, rising with her breath, shaping itself to her presence. She understood then. The villagers had locked her away to silence her, but in their cruelty, they had given her a sanctuary of shadows and flame, a place where she could awaken something that belonged to no mortal hand. The first sparks had come to her in silence, but they did not remain silent for long. Soon, the fire would speak louder than her whispers, louder than her songs, louder than the lies of those who condemned her. For within that hut of dust and despair, she was no longer just a starving girl. She was becoming something untouchable, something lit with the wrath of flame. The hut, once dark and suffocating, began to breathe with a pulse that was not its own. The girl lay curled on the dusty floor, her body frail, her lips cracked, her eyes dulled by endless nights of thirst and hunger. But somewhere deep within her, the prayers she had whispered into the void had gathered strength, not fading but weaving into something unearthly. At first she thought her mind had broken. She felt warmth on her fingertips, as though her blood itself had turned to glowing embers. She lifted her trembling hands and saw the faint shimmer of light outlining her skin, like threads of dawn stitched across her bones. The air around her thickened, heavy yet alive, and she heard it, low crackles, the sound of wood remembering fire. Her tears, which had always soaked into the dirt unseen, began to steam as they fell. The hut seemed to listen, its old walls humming in response, every straw of thatch, every dried branch in its structure vibrating faintly. She dragged her weak body upright, clutching the wooden beam for balance, and as her hand pressed against it, a faint glow spread across the wood like veins carrying fire. It did not burn her palm, though she could feel the warmth radiating, a strange comfort in her starvation. She should have been afraid, yet the exhaustion in her soul dulled fear, and what replaced it was awe. Her chest rose and fell, shallow, weak, yet each breath seemed to feed the growing glow. When she inhaled, the air grew tense, quivering with invisible heat. When she exhaled, sparks swirled in the dust, floating, refusing to die. She gasped, startled, but the sparks only multiplied, dancing like tiny fireflies circling her. She lifted her hand again, and this time the flames obeyed, spiraling upward, flickering in rhythm with her pulse. For the first time since they had locked her inside, she smiled faintly through her pain. Something inside her was answering her cries, something ancient and fierce. As night pressed against the hut, shadows thickened outside, but within her body glowed faintly, fire wrapping her like a second skin. The tatters of her dress lifted in the heat, swaying though no wind entered. The flame licked her hair, kissed her arms, coiled around her like a serpent, but it did not consume. Instead, it flowed with her movements, gentle yet untamed, a companion rising from her suffering. She remembered the villagers' words, the curse, the burden, the mouth that ate too much, the girl who brought misfortune. Yet here, in this forsaken place, she understood. They had feared her not because she was weak, but because somewhere in her blood, in her spirit, slept a power they could never control. Her hunger gnawed still, her body aching with every breath, but the flames dulled the sharpness of pain. She closed her eyes, and in the silence of the night, she whispered one last prayer, but this time it was not desperate. It was steady, sure, carrying the weight of fire. If I am to burn, let me burn with purpose. If I am to die, let it not be in silence. The flames brightened at her words, swirling like they understood. The hut began to glow faintly from the cracks, lines of light tracing the wood like molten veins. Outside, unseen, the villagers shifted uneasily in their homes, sensing something stirring in the dark. Her despair, her anguish, her years of quiet endurance, they had melted into something sharper, brighter, alive. The girl was no longer merely a victim, she was becoming the flame itself. When she opened her eyes again, they reflected the fire, glowing amber, steady and fierce, as if the hunger that had once hollowed her out now burned as fuel for something greater. The fire had awakened, and with it she was reborn, not as the girl they locked away, but as the fire they could never contain. The night lay heavy over the village, the kind of silence that usually came before storms. The moon floated pale and distant, watching the world below with an indifferent eye. But within the hut, silence had already been broken. Heat shimmered through its walls, thin cracks of light leaking into the darkness outside like a warning too faint to be believed. Inside, the girl stood upright though her body should have collapsed long ago, her frame wrapped in fire that moved like a living spirit. Each breath she took was a command, each heartbeat a drumbeat for flames that had been waiting, hungering. The first burst came sudden. A sharp crack of wood splitting rang through the air, startling a stray dog that yelped and fled into the bush. Sparks poured from the roof, swirling upward like a nest of angry stars. Then the flames leapt high, roaring free, and the hut that had been her prison erupted in a pillar of fire. The villagers, stirred from uneasy sleep, stumbled from their huts to witness it. Their whispers turned to cries when they saw not a pile of burning wood, but a figure walking through the inferno untouched, her body blazing like a goddess of wrath. Her steps left trails of glowing ash, her eyes gleamed molten, and the fire that crowned her hair burned brighter with every stride. The villagers recoiled, some clutching charms, others crossing themselves, all trembling at the sight they had birthed. They had wanted her gone, erased, consumed by hunger and silence. Instead, she had risen, transformed by their cruelty into something far greater, far deadlier. Then came the screams. The flames did not stay caged within the hut. They spilled outward, leaping from straw to straw, chasing the roofs of nearby huts, devouring them in moments. Fire moved as though it had memory, as though it knew whom to seek. It crept toward those who had laughed the loudest at her suffering, who had turned away when her cries reached their doors. One man shouted for water, flinging a pot from his doorstep, but the liquid turned to steam before it even touched the ground. Another tried to run, but fire licked his legs, dragging him down with a hiss of searing flesh. The girl did not speak, yet her silence commanded the fire, guided its hunger, sharpened its aim. Mothers clutched children and ran into the night, but even the air was aflame, glowing red with heat. The sky itself seemed to burn, smoke curling upward in great black waves. Chickens screeched, goats stampeded, but all around, the fire hunted with purpose, sparing only those who had once shown her a kind glance, a soft word. For them, the flames curled back like obedient dogs, leaving paths through the inferno. But for the rest, the guilty, the merciless, it devoured. The chief's hut, larger and prouder than the rest, caught fire last. He had been the one who declared her cursed, the one who ordered her locked away. Now he stumbled into the open, his face slick with fear, his voice hoarse as he shouted for his people to fight, to bring water, to save what they could. But no one listened. His words were swallowed by the roar of fire and the shrieks of the doomed. The girl's gaze found him, and in that instant the flames surged higher, climbing the sky like a wall. His own roof caved inward, crushing his treasures, his pride, his bed. The chief screamed once before the flames consumed both voice and body, leaving nothing but ash. The girl walked among the chaos, her bare feet glowing with heat but never burning. Her face was calm, almost sorrowful, yet her power moved with the rage of a storm. The villagers saw her silhouette framed in fire and realized too late that they had birthed their punishment with their own hands. Each scream, each crack of burning wood, was not random destruction but justice carved in flame. The fire had become her vengeance, her truth, her voice answering the silence they had forced upon her. By the time the night waned, the village was no more than a smoldering field. Where homes once stood, only charred skeletons remained. Smoke rose into the heavens, carrying with it the cries of the guilty. The survivors, few, trembling, eyes wide with horror, huddled at the edges of the ruin, too afraid to speak, too broken to move. And at the center of it all, where the prison hut had once stood, the girl remained, her body still crowned in fire. She looked upon the ashes, upon the destruction, and for the first time she did not feel hunger. The night of fire had come, and the world had answered her suffering with flames that none would ever forget. The fire did not stop at the huts. It moved outward like a living tide, spilling into the paths, the gardens, the fields that had fed the village for generations. The flames burned with hunger, yet it was not a wild, aimless blaze. It was precise, intentional, almost as though it could smell guilt. Each step the girl took seemed to guide it, and every spark carried judgment. Those who had once dragged her to the hut, who had mocked her cries and locked the door behind her, felt the fire's breath first. One of the men who had tied her hands tried to flee into the night, clutching his spear. He ran past the burning huts, his lungs choking with smoke, until he reached the edge of the millet field. But as he stumbled forward, fire sprang from the stalks themselves, curling upward as though the earth had exhaled flames just for him. He screamed, swatting wildly at the orange tongues that wrapped around his arms, but the more he fought, the faster they consumed him. Within moments he was nothing but a pile of blackened bones and glowing embers, his spear melted into useless iron. Another, the woman who had spat at the girl's cries and thrown dust in her face, tried to shield herself inside her hut. She poured water into a gourd and prayed loudly to the ancestors, demanding protection. But the ancestors did not answer. The fire curled along her roof like a serpent, then dropped inside, igniting her mats and pots. she shrieked, clutching her charms to her chest, but the flames paid no heed to beads or whispered incantations. Her hut collapsed with a crash of sparks, burying her under fire and smoke. The next morning, no trace of her remained but ash scattered in the wind. The chief's sons, who had mocked her weakness and jeered as she was dragged away, gathered near the edge of the river in desperate hope that water would save them. They leapt in, gasping, splashing, clinging to each other as the flames drew closer. For a moment they thought they had escaped. But the river boiled around them, steam hissing as the fire kissed its surface. They screamed as the water turned against them, blistering their skin, dragging them under. Their bodies never surfaced again. Villagers later whispered that the river had swallowed them, refusing to return the guilty to the earth. The chief himself faced a punishment far worse than any man deserved. His hut, the grandest in the village, was a symbol of pride, its roof layered thick with grass, its walls adorned with carvings. He burst from it as the fire leapt upon its crown, clutching his staff, eyes wide with terror. His voice, once booming with authority, cracked with desperation as he called out to the spirits, begging for forgiveness. But the girl stood across from him, her body glowing with firelight, her gaze unblinking. In that moment the flames surged higher, encircling him in a crown of fire. He stumbled, fell to his knees, and the roof of his hut collapsed behind him in a thunderous crash, sparks shooting into the sky. His cries ended abruptly, drowned beneath the roar of flames. One by one, every tormentor found their end. Fields that had been green and lush turned black under the fire's fury. Granaries that held the village's harvest burst into towers of flame, sending showers of sparks across the night sky. Goats, cows, and chickens fled in chaos, many consumed in the blaze, their cries blending with those of the villagers. The fire made no distinction between possessions, wealth, or pride. It took everything the guilty had built, reducing it to nothing but smoke. Even those who had played smaller roles in her suffering did not escape. The ones who had watched silently when she was dragged away, the ones who had shut their doors to her cries, felt the punishment too. Their huts burned, their gardens withered, their belongings turned to cinders. Some fell to their knees, begging the girl for mercy, but she did not raise her voice. The fire answered instead, crackling louder, wrapping around them like ropes of glowing judgment. By the time the moon crossed the sky, the village was a furnace. Homes collapsed inward, sending showers of sparks into the night. Fields smoldered, smoke rising in choking columns. The tormentors who had laughed and mocked, who had locked her away to starve, were no more than shadows burned into the earth. Their names were erased, their legacies turned to dust. All that remained was silence, broken only by the crackling of dying flames and the weeping of the few innocents spared. The punishment was not swift, it was deliberate, as though the fire wanted them to feel every ounce of the pain they had forced upon her. The heat that licked their skin echoed the hunger that had gnawed her belly. The smoke that clogged their lungs reflected the suffocating air of the hut. The cries they screamed into the night matched the ones she had whispered into the dark, unheard. Justice had come in fire, and there was no escape, no mercy, no forgiveness. By dawn, nothing of the tormentors remained. The village that had once thrived was now a skeleton of ash and smoldering ruins. Their fields were black, their homes gone, their voices silenced. The guilty had been reduced to ash, carried away by the wind as though they had never existed. The girl stood at the center of it all, the only flame still burning, her eyes reflecting the truth. Punishment had been delivered. The village did not vanish entirely that night. When dawn broke, when the last flames collapsed into smoldering embers and smoke rose like morning veils into the pale sky, a few survivors crawled out from hiding places. Their faces were streaked with soot and ash, their eyes red from smoke and tears, their voices hoarse from screaming. They were not many, only a handful, yet their presence was enough to carry the memory of what had unfolded. These were not the bold ones who had mocked her most loudly, nor the cruelest who had locked her away. They were those who had stood on the edges, some who had remained silent, others who had whispered doubts but never raised a hand to stop the injustice. Still, even they had not been spared the weight of the fire's judgment. They staggered among the ruins, stepping over blackened beams and the bones of those who had been reduced to ash. Smoke curled in the air, carrying with it the stench of burnt flesh and charred wood. Every crackle of cooling embers made them flinch, as though the fire might surge up once more to claim them. They whispered to one another in broken voices, but even in their grief they could not speak her name aloud. It burned on their tongues, heavy with shame and fear. At night, when darkness returned, none dared to sleep. They huddled together near what little remained of the riverbank, clutching one another like frightened children. The The sound of the night insects, once ordinary, now seemed ominous, every chirp and buzz carrying with it the memory of screams. And then came the whispers, the strange rustling that rose from the ashes of their village. At first they thought it was the wind, but as they listened they recognized something else. The faint echo of her voice, singing low and steady, the same song she had once sung to calm herself in the hut before hunger gnawed her silent. Those who heard it swore that the flames still carried her spirit. They claimed to see a figure moving through the ruins when the night was darkest, her body glowing faintly, her hair lit by embers that never died. Sometimes she stood by the remains of the huts, her hands outstretched as if she were warming herself by invisible fire. Other times she was seen walking across the blackened fields, her steps leaving behind faint sparks that glowed before vanishing into smoke. None dared approach her, for every instinct told them that she did not walk among them for comfort, but as a warning. One old woman among the survivors swore that on the second night she saw the girl's eyes, two glowing embers staring from the shadows, unblinking. She fainted in terror, and when she woke, her hair had turned white. Others whispered that when they tried to cook food, sparks leapt from the fire pit and burned their hands. They abandoned their pots, too afraid to feed themselves, for every flame reminded them of her wrath. Hunger stalked them now, just as it had once stalked her, and the irony was not lost on them. They whispered that this was her revenge, that the fire would never allow them to eat in peace again. Some tried to leave, thinking they could escape her shadow by fleeing into the forests or toward neighboring villages. But those who went did not return. At night, distant screams carried back on the wind, followed by the acrid smell of burning. The survivors who remained shook in terror, convinced that the girl's spirit walked with them, punishing cruelty wherever it tried to hide. The flames follow the guilty, they murmured, too afraid to raise their voices. And the earth remembers everything. Children born afterward grew up with this fear carved into their bones. Their mothers whispered warnings by firelight: never mock the weak, never cast out the innocent, never close your ears to cries for help. For if you do, the fire will find you. At night, when families gathered around small hearths to warm themselves, the children swore they saw shadows flicker in ways that did not belong to the flames. They would clutch their mothers tightly and ask if she was near, if the spirit of the girl still lingered among them. The mothers hushed them but never denied it, for deep down they knew the truth. The terror did not fade with time. The survivors carried it with them to their graves, haunted by visions of her burning figure. Some said she stood at the foot of their beds when they tried to sleep, her face glowing with firelight, her lips curled in silence. Others claimed their dreams were filled with smoke and screams, their bodies waking drenched in sweat as if the hut were burning all over again. None could escape her, for she was no longer just a girl, she was the flame itself, the fire that judged cruelty and remembered the cries of the innocent. So the survivors became the keepers of her story. They did not tell it with pride or strength, but with trembling voices, their eyes darting toward the hearth as if afraid she might rise from the flames once more. They said that when you wrong the innocent, the fire will rise, and it will not stop until every cruelty is punished. They whispered that her spirit still walked among the embers, watching, listening, waiting for the night when it must burn again. Even now, they said, if you listen closely on the darkest nights, you can hear her voice within the fire's crackle, soft, steady, unyielding. A song of hunger turned to rage, of pain turned to judgment. And those who mocked her, those who laughed as she starved, were gone, while she remained, walking forever in the flames. Generations passed, and the ruins of that village faded into the soil, yet no grass grew where the huts had once stood. The earth remained blackened, the soil brittle, as if scorched from within by a fire that never cooled. Travelers avoided the place, and those who wandered too close swore that at night the ashes glowed faintly, as though the ground itself still breathed flame. In time, the story of the girl who had been locked away and starved, only to rise with fire in her soul, became more than memory, it became legend. The people began to call her the Fire Maiden, a name spoken with both reverence and fear. Around village fires, elders would gather the children and tell the tale, their voices hushed, their faces solemn. They spoke of the cruelty that had condemned an innocent girl to hunger and despair, and how her anguish became flame that punished those who mocked her. The story carried weight, not only as a warning but as a lesson carved into the bones of the land itself. Never starve the innocent, never mock the helpless, for the fire of their pain may one day consume you. Parents would point to the hearth when children grew restless, telling them, the fire remembers. When little ones asked why flames sometimes crackled too loudly or cast shadows that seemed too alive, their mothers whispered that the Fire Maiden was listening, watching through the embers. And when food was placed on the cooking fire, Families made it a ritual to set aside a small portion in silence, not for themselves but as an offering to her spirit. It was said that if you failed to do this, your hearth might betray you, flames leaping higher than they should, smoke filling the hut until you could not breathe. Her story was not only about punishment but about justice, a reminder that no cruelty went unseen. Villagers retold how the guilty had been swallowed by flame while the innocent spirit became one with the fire. As generations passed, the tale took on ritual significance. During droughts, when fire threatened to destroy crops, people prayed to her, asking forgiveness for wrongs they might have committed against the weak. During feasts, they lit a special fire at the center of the village, keeping it tended all night as a sign of respect, so that the fire maiden would not mistake their laughter for mockery or their abundance for arrogance. The fear of her became a kind of reverence. Her legend grew until she was no longer seen merely as a wronged girl, but as an eternal guardian of the innocent, a spirit who punished cruelty wherever it was found. They said that when children went hungry, the fire maiden's spirit wept, and her flames whispered through the night winds, warning those who hoarded food or turned away from the needy. They said that when someone mocked another's suffering, sparks would rise mysteriously from the hearth, as if the fire maiden's anger had been kindled again. Travelers from distant lands began to hear of her too. The story spread across regions, carried by traders and wanderers who swore they had seen the glow of fire dancing in abandoned fields. Some described a figure moving in the smoke, a woman whose hair glowed like coals and whose eyes burned like embers. Though no one could say for certain, the legend gained power in its retelling, a reminder to all who heard it that fire was not just destruction, it was also justice. Over time, the fire maiden became a symbol woven into proverbs. Mothers told their children, "Do not let your heart grow cruel or the fire maiden will hear your silence." Farmers reminded each other, "Do not hoard the harvest while others starve, for the fire maiden walks in the smoke." And when disputes arose within villages, people would caution one another with the saying, "Be careful, for fire does not forget." The legend also became a ritual of remembrance. Once a year, during the season of longest nights, some villages would gather and prepare a small meal. They would place part of it near the fire, whispering the fire maiden's name as they watched the flames consume the offering. It was said that if the fire burned evenly and calmly, her spirit was satisfied, but if the flames sputtered and smoked, it meant that cruelty still lingered in the village and needed to be purged. Though centuries passed, though the names of kings and warriors faded into dust, the fire maiden's name remained. Her story was told not in temples or carved stones, but in the whispered warnings of mothers, the cautious offerings of families, and the fear that flickered in every fire's glow. For what happened once could happen again, and the people believed that fire was always listening, always ready to rise when injustice was too great to ignore. Thus her legacy endured. She was not remembered as a victim but as a force, born of cruelty yet transformed into justice. And as long as fires burned in hearths and villages, her spirit would remain close. For even now, when the flames crackle too sharply, when shadows dance strangely on the wall, and when a sudden spark leaps from the hearth to the floor, the old ones shake their heads and murmur, "She is here. The fire maiden walks again." Generations later, long after the charred bones of the village had been swallowed by grass and the blackened huts had crumbled into dust, her story lived on in whispers that refused to fade. No matter how many seasons passed, the people could not forget the girl who had been locked away to starve, abandoned in cruelty, only for fire itself to rise at her side. To the elders, she was no longer just a wronged child. She had become a symbol, a spirit that embodied the memory of injustice and the burning force of retribution. They called her the Fire Maiden, and her name was spoken with both reverence and dread. Every evening, as fires were lit in hearths and cooking flames flickered in the dusk, her legend stirred anew. Mothers would hush their children with warnings, "Do not mock the hungry, do not turn away the suffering, for the Fire Maiden watches through the smoke." Children would press closer to the fire, gazing into the dancing embers, half convinced that eyes glowed back at them from the coals. They would whisper about her, imagining her hair like ribbons of flame, her voice carried in the crackling wood, her spirit forever alive in firelight. With each retelling, the lesson deepened. It was said that to starve the innocent was to call forth her wrath. To deny the weak or the humble was to invite fire into one's home. And so villages created customs to guard themselves from her vengeance. Whenever food was shared, a portion was placed into the flames, an offering to the Fire Maiden so she would know that cruelty did not dwell in that household. When families built new huts, they burned small twigs at the threshold, whispering her name to cleanse the home of injustice. Some even believed that every flame carried part of her spirit, and so no fire was ever left untended, for to let it die abruptly was to dishonor her memory. Travelers carried the story far beyond the land where she had lived and died. Merchants whispered of villages that had burned overnight with no cause, their people claiming they had mocked a beggar child days before. Wanderers told of fires that erupted in fields after families hoarded grain during famine. Always, the Fire Maiden's name was tied to these tales, her legend spreading wider than the flames themselves. Soon, even in lands where no one remembered her face, people still feared her wrath. To deny the hungry became more than cruelty, it became dangerous, as though fire itself would rise to accuse the guilty. The legend grew not only as a warning but as a guide for living. Parents taught their children that kindness was as necessary as water, that to share food was to protect oneself from the Fire Maiden's anger. Proverbs were born from her memory: the fire remembers, flames are the tears of the wronged, and do not starve another lest fire starve you. Her story became so woven into daily life that people could not light a flame without thinking of her. Each spark, each glow of a coal, was a reminder that the innocent were not defenseless, that even when abandoned their pain could ignite justice. Over time, rituals formed around her legend. During the season of harvest, when food was plentiful, a fire was built at the center of villages. Families would gather and place their first fruits, grains, or roasted meat into the flames before eating, a tradition to honor the Fire Maiden and ensure the village would not be consumed by her wrath. When drought struck and the sun baked the earth, villagers prayed not only for rain but also to appease her spirit, begging her not to let her flames burn beyond control. Even warriors carried her name into battle, painting flame marks on their shields and whispering that the Fire Maiden walked beside the just. And yet, the fear of her never fully softened. Fire still held a mystery, an unpredictability that reminded people of her vengeance. Sometimes when a fire roared too high, villagers swore they heard screams in its crackle, the echoes of those who had once mocked and locked her away. At night, when embers glowed red in the hearth, some claimed to see the shape of a girl in the shadows, head bowed, eyes burning, waiting to rise again. No one dared to laugh at such stories, for to mock her name was to tempt the fire itself. Thus, her story endured, carried like a spark through time. It became more than legend, more than warning, it became a truth embedded in the heart of the people. The Fire Maiden was no longer just a victim but a guardian, a force that punished cruelty and defended innocence with the most unstoppable element of all. Generations later, her tale still burned in every fire, every hearth, every flicker of flame. For the people had learned this: cruelty could not go unanswered, and the suffering of the innocent was never forgotten. The earth could cover bones, the wind could scatter ashes, but the fire remained, and it remembered. And so, even now, when villagers gather around the fire at night and the shadows grow long, they murmur to one another, "Never starve the innocent, never mock the helpless." For fire itself may rise in their defense, and the Fire Maiden will walk again.